everybody. My name is Regina. I am the founder of EGW, as we call ourselves in short. We were founded about 7 years ago when I was sitting at Future Publishing. I was the international director there, and realized that after 20 years, I really needed to do something else because, you know, when you do the same job for so long, it gets a little bit stale over time. So I've decided to form an agency that helps every publisher to create international revenue streams. And by that, I mean that if you're a company like Future, you have a lot of resources and everything is easy. But if you're a smaller publisher, then you just can't get that off the ground because it tends to, you know, cost a lot of money. So 7 years later, we have an experienced team of senior executives from the area of licensing and rights. That in particular for magazines, digital and websites. Despite what everybody says, magazines are still going strong, not in the way that they used to be in the old days. But think about that, just because the car was introduced, the bicycle hasn't disappeared from the scene. And it's a little bit like that with magazines as well. In addition to that, we have a team of specialized translators and editors because we help people to localize their content. That means that we can, we have about 30 translators on the payroll and about 15 on standby. So we do a lot of translation work for publishers. We have an extensive publishing network with over 2,000 publishers. That just comes from, you know, the time when you're that long in the industry, you kind of meet a lot of people. We're multilingual. I think between us, we probably cover about 10 languages. So we can do the major 5, and we can cover quite a few of the more specialist languages as well. And we have global reach. So we're active in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, in the US, and in Latin America. And each of those countries, of those territories, kind of become of more or less focus over the years, depending on what's happening in those markets. So today I'm talking to you about the routes to international markets, the revenue streams that will help you to make more money in times when it's really needed. And again, if you think about the pandemic that we've all been through or are still going through, that has put an enormous pressure onto alternative revenue streams. And what we have seen is when retail closed down, a lot of men's magazines have started struggling quite badly because typically they don't have that much presence in the in supermarkets. But it was those supermarkets that really kept it going for publishers. So if they didn't have a presence with their magazines, then life became very hard. But at the same time, we saw a revival of women's magazines in those places, and that also drove demand of that kind of product in the licensing world, because a lot of publishers that were, typically publishing male magazines suddenly needed direly topics that were more female-driven. And so during the pandemic, funnily enough, licensing and syndication really didn't stop, as didn't export. So it was a very, very good income, a lifesaver for some publishers, I would say. It just makes sense because you already produce that content. It's there. You don't have to invest any more money to get it into those markets, and you really need to find a way to make your content sweat. And so this is what we will be covering today. So our first part is export. So what does export mean? It means you distribute your magazines abroad. So in other words, when the time comes that you put your print orders together, you add a whole lot on top of that, you print a bit more, and you send that to other countries. That in itself is interesting because, when you work like yourselves in Canada, you have longer closure windows than most of Europeans, for example, do. So if you consider Europe has, on the whole, 3 months of a closure window, and the UK even only 1 month. So, that makes life a lot easier because you can react much, much faster. You will also probably work with a local distributor, and we hear of one in particular who was one of the biggest ones in Europe tomorrow, and they can tell you more in detail about it. But what they will do for you is they will take care of the retail sell-in, because there is no way in the world, if you export your magazines the way that they are, that you can have the knowledge of all those countries and the retail platform that you're dealing with. So a good distributor will take that off you. They will work the logistics for you. They will identify promotions for you. They will work very, very closely with your team hand in hand to make sure that you still maintain control over what's happening to your magazines. What you need to remember is when you export copies, typically they arrive a month late, because in order to make it cost effective, you will put it on a ship, and the ship takes a long time. But that's not a problem. And, the export world is well geared up to that, and readers don't mind. So that's fine. When, however, you have time-sensitive content, you need to find other avenues. So if a country is really important for you, let's say you would put it into the US and you have a 300 million audience, you might want to consider maybe even printing in the US. But if that's not an opportunity, because your magazine might be too small, you would probably do it. You could send it by air. Let's say you're covering the Tour de France, for example, or you have something that just cannot wait a month and would be time sensitive. So that's when you would put it on a plane. But that is something that your distributor would help you with. So what are the pros of exporting? Well, you have access to large language markets. And if you consider you are in Canada, that means many of you speak English and publish in English, and many of you speak French. So that for you means you have access to Australia, New Zealand, UK, USA. Now imagine what that does to your sales level. And if you consider that the UK is already doing this very successfully, and it literally adds about 50% of revenues to the income line, then I always wondered, how is it possible that the other countries don't do that? So where's the blockage here? Why isn't that happening? Because you don't really need to do anything. You have the magazines, you just ship it over. And what that also does is increases sales for your advertisement departments, for your ad departments, so they can go back to their clients and say, and demonstrate much higher sales than they could before, and in return they will get higher advertising revenues. It's just kind of a no-brainer, really. On the con side, of course, we need to look at both areas. It can bind large amount of cash flow. So, if I think back into my days at Future, we were working mostly with closure windows of 10 months. And so, it would take us a long, long time before we could make any alterations. And that's that can be tricky, because you might have pushed out so many copies for a long time, but then suddenly halfway through that period an area doesn't work anymore. Now let me assure you, I have to tell you what can go wrong, but this doesn't often happen, because usually you have a pretty good hold on things. It can also happen that a ship sinks. Of course, that can happen, and it did happen once in 20 years, but it's not something that happens every 3 weeks. So those risks that could happen, don't the positives outweigh the negatives, is what I'm saying. You do need to develop a team who understand local markets, though, and that's important, because not every market is the same, and sometimes there is a delay. So if you consider what happens to new areas, they start on the West Coast and then they travel down, and so it takes time. So what is working in certain areas isn't necessarily working in other areas yet. But if you develop a team, they will understand that, and again, they would be talking to your distributor and would be informed about those things. And that leads us to licensing. So what is licensing? Licensing means that you are selling your magazine rights to a local publisher in a different country. And they will then take your magazine, they will make certain additions to it to make it suitable for the market that they're operating in, and they will be responsible for selling their ad sales. So in addition, you will then typically receive a licensing fee per issue, and you will probably negotiate a certain cut on other revenues like advertising, depending on what the brand is. If you're, for example, publishing yoga, maybe you have a clothesline that you want to license to them, or you will allow them to publish a clothesline on the strength of your brand, but then you would want to have a cut on that as well. So, those are the things that you need to consider. So it's not just the licensing fee, it's all the little add-ons that that brand earns for you and for that publisher. And then the big question is, of course, should you do this in-house or with an agent like we are? Well, if you do it in-house, then you have costs associated with that. And if you're a large publisher, you can afford that with no problem. If you're a smaller publisher, then maybe that's not so affordable for you, because you would need at least 3 people, and they have to be experienced people. So you can't really, work with school leavers, and you need to have, a reasonable travel budget, and all of that can add up quite a lot before you start seeing any money. So working with an agent makes that a lot more affordable for you, and and it doesn't require an upfront investment of that kind. Agents also have contacts abroad that your new team might yet have to develop, and they take care of contracts and renewals, which is also a big cost that is of your line. And really, they can operate at a tiny fraction of the cost. So for smaller publishers, that's probably the way to go. So what are the cons? The cons are the pros are, of course, it's cost effective, because you don't have to invest anything. And even if you invest something, if you have a good, strong international offering, it will pay back very, very quickly. It is also low risk because your money keeps coming in. You form agreements with publishers on a long-term view, so they're either 3 or 5 years, and you can make sure that whatever happens, your money keeps coming in and in and in and in. You don't carry that risk if something doesn't work. It increases brand awareness, of course. So you have it helps your advertising team, because in this case, you will have advertisement clients that are local to you, but those clients, if they're big international players, they would probably have a base somewhere in London, for example, or in Düsseldorf, or depending wherever you sell the license to, so you can tap into that revenue as well. And many publishers indeed offer international ad sales on behalf of their partners, and retain a number of pages in the license that you can use at your disposal. So the operating cost, the profit margin that you can get from licensing, and this is what makes it so very, very attractive, is somewhere in the region between 70 and 85%. And you have departments that are that will generate more money, but they will not operate at that profit margin. The negatives of licensing is that markets can take a hit. That can happen. Look at Turkey at the moment. Turkey is having a really, really hard time with their local currency, and in addition, the pandemic hit them hard. So at the moment, the lira is very, very cheap for us, but expensive. Currencies are very expensive to them. And so paper becomes almost unaffordable for them at the moment. And in addition, they also have the 50% paper increases that we have globally. So Turkey is a market where at the moment nothing works. And if you have put all your money into Turkey, then you would see a hit there. again, your money wouldn't be into Turkey, and you would probably see that coming as well. So you would make adjustments as you go along. Publishers can go bust. That happens. It doesn't happen often, but it happens. And if that happens, then you can get burned in that process. However, you can prepare for all of that by having timely accounting to make sure that your accounting departments, your account departments invoice frequently, and also follow up what's happening. And if somebody doesn't pay you on time, then chase it. And that's where you see when problems arise. So on the whole, and believe me, I've been in this market for over 20 years. I've maybe seen 2 people go bust. So it's, again, not something that happens frequently. Things that you also need to get right for licensing is that you need to have your rights clearance covered. And that's a must, and it's difficult to achieve with editors because they'd rather spend the money on getting good content than paying for extra rights. As the rule of thumb, you have to consider that we're probably talking about 80% of your rights need to be cleared. That's kind of what the industry standard seems to demand. And by that, I mean 80% of good content has to be cleared. That means that the cover is available and things like that. And if the cover isn't available, of course, then you make alternative covers available, for example, to justify the licensing fee. Content needs to have an appeal abroad. Yeah, so I can tell you of a publisher who published a camera magazine and a digital camera magazine. They were based in London, and they photographed all the lovely landmarks that London has to offer, every issue. And the content is almost inexhaustive because London is a big place. The problem is when you're a publisher in Singapore, maybe once in a while you would like to see a temple or something that's more more local to you. So bear that in mind. The larger your licensing portfolio grows, you need to make room for taking that on board and making it attractive for these people to stay on board with you. There are today licensing magazines that are only in existence because of their licensing revenue. So don't underestimate the importance of that. It's also important that when you have just-in-time production that is required for time-sensitive content we mentioned before, like cycling and sporting events, usually as much as with export, you're sort of a month behind. But with certain events unfolding quickly, you need to be able to just almost, exchange the content on a report by report basis, so page by page basis, and not wait until the magazine is finished. But that's all doable, and it's not really all that difficult. You have an excellent opportunity for international ad sales. I mentioned that before, where you can offer international ad sales on behalf of your partners and make a lot of money in the process. And licensing rights are typically on an exclusive basis. But in return, that means you can sell it only once in one country. But the return of that is, of course, that you have 3 or 5 years of revenues coming in, and you would charge royalties on top. So that's all fairly positive. And that leads us to syndication. The difference to licensing with syndication is that instead of selling the rights to a magazine to a publisher, you only sell parts of your magazine. This can be reports, this can be columns, that can be pages. I mean, literally everything. You therefore will identify the strong content that you have. You saw it in the presentation from Joris. This can be text. You might have a lot of videos, depending on what you publish. You might have patterns on craft, or you have tutorials, images, whatever it is that you publish that is strong and that has a chance to sell. You want to use it on platforms like TCE, or even do it yourself. This can and does run parallel to licensing, so you're not limited to licensing only. You can have a double approach to these things. The pros of syndication is that the content is non-exclusive. So this means you can sell it over and over and over again. And if you consider you have the launch of an Apple iPhone, of a new, very, very superb launch of an Apple iPhone, the whole world will ask for it. So, you will make a lot of money on good content. However, you can also sell it exclusively at a very high premium, and how people like Getty deal with that. Well, those rules apply to yourself as well. Bear in mind, newspapers have a solid syndication budget because they are specialized in news and affairs, but they're not so well staffed to handle lifestyle content or any female content that they might add on a Sunday for just to keep their sales going. So newspapers tend to be a very, very strong client for those for your syndication offers. You also have access to other industries because now we have a whole new retail base that offers their content, their goods online, but what they don't have is somebody who actually describes these goods. They need photos, they need words, and that offers you an access into an industry that you wouldn't otherwise reach with, through the publishing network. Always remember that certain content is high in demand, like videos are very much liked in the digital world because they bring people on board, they increase footfall and viewers. And so, the value of those is pretty high. And your value of content can suddenly increase when you have, example, I don't know, Prince died, David Bowie died, and all of a sudden everybody wants that. And if you have that kind of content, you can cream off the market. So the negative parts of syndication is that those can be singular transaction, and they can be of small value. I mean, you might sell an article for £200 or euros or whatever currency you operate in, but then you have to ask yourself, is it worth your while to spend 2 hours or 3 hours to get that article and the paperwork and all that done? Just for one article? That's not really worth your while, because you can land very quickly in negative equity if you're a smaller publisher. If you're a larger publisher and you have a dedicated team to it, brilliant. But with a smaller team, probably not. And that's where people like TCE come in, and they can really help you, get revenue sorted for you. And then the fourth element of this is you do your own publishing. And this is something that we are seeing more and more and more within the European trade. So what that means is you take your magazine and you translate your content and use agencies to get it into those countries. So we do a lot of work into England, into Germany, into the Netherlands at the moment, also from America. And that's very low production, because if you identify the strong markets and that you get a licensing fee, let's say anywhere between 3,000 and 6,000, whatever it might be, for the German market, but you can sell 20,000 copies there for sure, you would go and sell 20,000 copies because that will make you more money. And so that's where we are taking and advising our publishers that those magazines that they publish, where they know they have a winner on in their portfolio, they should do that themselves in those countries, and in other countries operate under licensing, because they probably don't know those markets as well as a local publisher would do. And so you get a strong income, and you can combine it with licensing. If you use an agency, they will translate it for you, and they will do it cheaply because they are specialized in translating for the media industry. And believe me, that's very different than going to a normal translation agency who will charge you 12 cents a word. That's not going to work, because that's just too expensive. But and those agencies also tend to work with local distributors, so they are there where you can't be. If you're in Canada, you cannot hop on a plane every 4 weeks and go and see your distributor. It's just not possible. Or check the retail environment, but your agents can do that for you. So the pros is that that it offers you large revenues. It gives you access to really large markets. Think of Germany, think of the UK, think of France if you're a French-speaking Canadian publisher. Think of the USA. So all that is possible for you. It allows targeted ad sales, which means that you can, that you can go and do you can really sell your advertising into all your local editions, which gives you ultimately more income than doing it for your local edition only. But most importantly, it gives you also control over your brand. I had a situation when I was at Future where one of our Balkan publishers took a license of T3, and when we flicked through it before it went to publish, we had to pre-approve it. They had a whole section on machetes and things like that. That, of course, we didn't want to be associated with, so we made it stop. But when you publish yourself, you don't have those problems. And the negative part of this is that markets differ. Example, the German market loves socks, knitting socks, for whatever reason. I don't know why and what's behind that, but they just love it. And most German women have a basket with wool in their little corner somewhere, and they knit socks in their private time. Well, that's something that's an idiosyncrasy that you won't find in other markets easily. So you need to have somebody who tells you, don't do that. This would not work here. It would only work there. And that's and that's where your agents or your distributor come in and help you. Here's a few examples of what that can look like. So this is a magazine that was produced for a German, for an English publisher actually, that publishes in Germany at the time when Lemmy died. And this was put together very, very quickly. So this is an example of a very time-sensitive example, and sold very well. Here is something that, again, a German publisher does. He takes a magazine license out of England. Kitchen Garden magazine is the leading how-to publisher. When I would like to grow your own publisher, I would like to say. But it needs to be changed from the content point of view, because the seasonality is slightly different, so things don't grow at the same time, and tastes are different. So this is an example where a magazine can be licensed and yet also changed. This is a one-to-one translation from Future, and they take Taylor Swift and they publish that in many markets, including France, Spain, and the Netherlands. And this is a Danish publisher, and they have an anti-inflammatory diet bookazine that they publish so many times a year, and they go into Germany, Netherlands, and UK. So you can see that the European market is well accustomed to that, and probably a lot of you would have similar content that would work just as well in the European market. Just a brief thing, what we can do for you, if you want to talk about licensing, syndication, or if you want to have any kind of consultation, or you need translations at a cost-effective way, talk to us. Here's our contact details. So if you have any questions, please get in touch with me or ask me now.
What should a magazine publisher ask in deciding whether to license or syndicate their publication?
You mean whether they should do one or the other, or whether they should do both?
Well, whether they should do one or the other, and what kinds of things they need to take in account to make that decision.
Okay. They would have to check whether they have the rights, and whether they have, and by that I mean text and photo rights. That's one thing. And then they need to assess whether the content is good for international markets. So, if you have a magazine about parenting in France, and it's full of events just in Paris, then that's of no use to anyone, because I doubt that, the people from Latvia would go to France for an international, for a parenting event that they probably don't even understand because it's in French. So, it needs to have some level of international appeal.
Right. And how much of an initial time commitment would each option need?
Well, I mean, if you do it in-house, then it's a full-time job. But if you work with an agent, then it's really not. I mean, it depends how you want to work with your agent. Some publishers want to have a weekly update, even though I think that that's too much, really, because um, licensing tends to work at the speed of an oil tanker because there is more at stake. It just works slower, because it's not just the matter of buying a license. You then, that publisher then has to make the staff available, and they have to look into labor laws and all that. So it's all a little bit slower. But when it's there, it's very, very steady. So, if you work with an agent, you don't have very much, you don't need another person um, to take on that, that revenue stream.
Okay. And another question is, would you recommend starting small and targeting one market or revenue stream only at first and then scaling up later?
No, what I would do is I would take a magazine or two that have international appeal, and I would just go everywhere with that magazine. And once you have exhausted that, you add another and another and another. That's how I would do it. Mm.
What types of content are in demand this year?
The type of content that's in demand is really bookazines, and that started with the pandemic, because not only were female magazines suddenly at the forefront, but we also noticed that that people were going more onto a more meaningful way of life, and that meant that James also mentioned that at the beginning. Special interests and hobby titles, everything of that kind, gardening, and that goes in line with what Chris said a second ago, that gardening magazines have suddenly become very attractive, and that kitchen garden magazine is something that happened in the pandemic. So that's content that's very attractive. Anything that is I say monothematic, yeah. Anything, because when what I noticed is that when iTunes were launched, people's consumer behavior has just changed somewhat. They didn't want to buy a magazine anymore that covered all of those, various articles that they weren't really interested in, but they bought it for two articles. Now they want their content, their subject matter covered, and that's why why there's an explosion of bookazines. I showed you a second ago, the three bookazines from Bonnier on anti-inflammatory. That's a massive, massive area at the moment, and there's not very much around. So it's very difficult to get your hands on content for that kind. So anything that's sort of health related, women's interest, but not celebrity stuff, but like a proper interest that teaches people how to do something. Even World War II for men, that kind of thing always works.
Okay. Calvin Gill asks, would it make sense to create ads catered to products that are also targeted to the country that we're licensing to specifically? Is it worth it to create different ad campaigns for different countries?
It definitely is, because if that will help you to get, to get revenue, then of course, because if you have a large enough magazine, why wouldn't you do that? You have a license. The license is, even though the license you give that to a different publisher, but essentially, the intellectual property is yours. It's your content. And so, why wouldn't you approach international advertisement agencies, and make it attractive to them? Because when you award the license, you keep a number of pages to yourself, and you do with those pages whatever you see fit.
That's excellent. This might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but off the top of your head, do you have examples of magazines that have done these kinds of ad campaigns before, and it might have worked for them?
Yes, Stuff magazine, T3 magazine, Digital Camera probably have done quite a bit of that. Then you have magazines like, like Elle, or, all those fashion magazines.
Right.
They do that. I'm into them. It's second nature.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Alison McGrain asks, can you put together a bookazine with past content and not fresh content?
Yes, you can. It depends, of course. If you, for example, think of certain content just doesn't age. If you think of craft, if it's not exactly high fashion, then craft content doesn't tend to age very much. An amigurumi of cute little toys is, it doesn't matter whether it was published today or 2 years ago. A cute bunny is a cute bunny. Of course, if your content is 50 years old, you might want to call it retro. But there's it depends on the content. But yes, and that's the beauty. So it allows you to have, if you publish your regular frequency magazines, and you have a lot of content on music, why wouldn't you put a music special together on a certain celebrity, or on the Queen, for example, who will have Jubilee this summer. So so you know.
Okay, Stephen asks, what kinds of content do best in print only, where the reader needs to hold the magazine? Are they recipes, images, and the reader keeps that copy and builds their resource library? So, are there specific examples of content you can give that work for that?
Well, there's a whole range of magazines that work. The luxury market, as James said, because that's coffee table style. People just like to have that on their table, and they like to show off because it sort of says who they are, or at least that's what they hope for. So the whole aspirational element will never go away. You also have certain things like craft magazines, for example, or anything that holds instructions. It's just better to do in print. And I think that's why that kind of print will never go away, because it's just not easy to do on your on your screen. You don't really want to cook in your kitchen with recipes and have fingers full of dough and then navigate on your phone. It's just not practical. So that's where magazines have a strong reason to be sustained.
Definitely. And are there any mistakes people make in terms of licensing and syndication?
Um, yes, I think the biggest mistake that people make is that they operate from a viewpoint that a large publisher is the best licensee that you can have. And that's often really not the case, because, if you go to somebody like Hachette, or I don't know, Meredith, or any of those really big entities, what tends to happen is that, yes, they like that magazine and they can, they want it, but as soon as that magazine doesn't make them enough money, it's out. Whereas if you go to a smaller publisher, I'm not suggesting that you go to a one-man band, but a reasonably sized publisher, what you will find is that they much more depend on those revenues, and they will develop it because they will see it as their baby. So that's one big thing to consider. The other thing is that they give their editors often too much leadway. So if an editor takes on a license, they're often a little bit disappointed, because an editor wants to have a magazine and make it his baby. And what then tends to happen is that the editor will go to his publisher and say, oof, the content is really not good enough, and it doesn't do this and it doesn't do that. The only reason they do that is because they want to write it themselves. And this happens over and over and over again. So there needs to be a really good balance, because you don't need to reinvent the wheel for certain things. It's just no need. It will just make the cost base much more expensive.
What kind of lead time should a publisher expect in exporting their magazine when they just start that process for the first time?
Well, I guess you need to consider 2-3 months, because it takes so long for the copies to reach that area. So if you want to get ready for the Christmas market, you need to plan ahead. You can't think in November. Oh, I've got a nice little bookazine how to make Christmas cookies, and off you go, because that will arrive in retail much later. You also need to consider selling times for retail. So on the whole, I would say in Europe you need at least 3 months.
Okay, um, that's good to keep in mind. And if one is a small publisher considering exporting their magazine, how exactly do they get started? What are the first steps that they need to take?
The first steps that they need to take is look at their portfolio, and then I suggest that they get in touch with somebody like IPS, and who are a local distributor, and they can get you access into all of those markets and have a good chat with them, and they will basically hold your hand throughout the whole process, and save you a lot of otherwise difficult learning, and maybe quite costly learning. But they will do the hard work for you.